Menzies was at university here at the University of Melbourne before even radio had been invented. And so what was the popular culture of the day? It was books and poetry. And it was the Bible, and it was Shakespeare, and it was part of our shared inheritance.
Welcome to Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute, hosted by Georgina Downer. There's a side to Robert Menzies that few Australians have ever encountered. The poet, the lover of verse, the man who found in words a kind of moral and emotional release. In our newly published collection, Fancies I Dare Not Speak, the hidden verse of R.G. Menzies, we get a glimpse of the private reflections of a statesman whose inner life was richer and much more expressive than many might imagine. Robert Menzies, or Bob, began writing poetry as a boy in Jeparat in far western Victoria when he was just 10 years old, and he penned a rhyming account of a local football match, Jeps versus Bows, Jeparat versus Rainbow. He continued writing throughout his university years here at the University of Melbourne, crafted sonnets, odes and reflections on nature and nationhood that reveal himself as both an idealist and a patriot. Poetry gave Menzies leave to express what he was not able to in public life, his tenderness, his humour and self-reflection. As his daughter Heather Henderson later observed, his verse reveals a lighter side of her father, a man who could write affectionate ditties for family and colleagues as easily as he could deliver an oration to the nation. So today, to help us explore this literary side of Robert Menzies, I'm joined by two very special guests who understand both the poetic and political dimensions of this world. Julian Leeser, the Shadow Minister for Education and Early Learning and for the Arts and Federal Member for Berowra, who will be launching Fancies I Dare Not Speak tonight here at the Robert Menzies Institute, and Dr. Damien Freeman, philosopher, lawyer and fellow of the Robert Menzies Institute. And I think most importantly in this podcast, the writer or author of our introduction to this lovely collection. So welcome to Afternoon Light, both of you.
Thanks so much for having me, Georgina.
Well, it's great to have you both here, both from Sydney and both here in Melbourne, to talk about something that we've been working on for a few years here at the Robert Menzies Institute that is a little bit off our usual focus of Australian political history, Australian history of the Menzies era, but I think actually one of our most important pieces of research and work because it gives you a more fulsome picture of Robert Menzies. Julian, you are Shadow Minister for the Arts. You've had a personal love of the arts and you've been a deep admirer and scholar of Menzies too. I mean, why do you think things like poetry and literature are important to Australia, the nation?
Well, I think they're important because they're part of our inheritance. And I think when you think about the story of Robert Menzies, poetry and art and literature are not something that's the preserve of the elite. This is a bloke who grew up in a one-horse town in Jeparat, went to a one-teacher school, made his way in the world through winning scholarships. But he had this deep life of the mind, which was not uncommon in his generation of parliamentarians, as Damien well points out in his introduction. It's important because literature, but particularly poetry, gives us a chance to reflect on the world. And in some respects, the art form of poetry, whether it's rhyming or not, is more memorable than just reading mere prose. Poetry is designed to be read aloud. It has a certain timbre, it has a certain rhythm. And for a person who, like Menzies, loved the spoken word and the written word and sweated over words in speeches, you know, being able to draw on poetry was really important and no doubt an inspiration to him right throughout his life.
Yeah, I mean, the art of writing poetry is a sort of mainstream pursuit and interest, and reading poetry as a mainstream interest is no longer with us. Of course, there are poets and there are books of poetry, but they're in a sort of deep, dark part of the bookshop. They're certainly not, in the new release blockbuster section. I mean, they reflect a bygone era where we didn't have TV, obviously didn't have social media, but we, maybe didn't even have much access to radio. So using poetry was an outlet. It was a form of entertainment. And I think you can see that in the way Robert Menzies plays with poetry, that is entertaining himself and others and giving you a sense of how he saw the world. What do you think, Damien?
Yeah, I think it's true that it was something that was much more accessible to ordinary people. It was not a specialised niche interest in those days. I think it's particularly seen, we have accounts of some of the things that people going off to war in the First World War would take in their knapsack. And they would take books of poetry and translations of Persian poetry as well as Shakespeare, things like this. It tells you something. I'm not saying everyone who went did that, but enough of them did. And it's a sort of remarkable thing. We couldn't imagine that today, something quite like that. And it speaks to the nature of the people. And they did have this, they were much more in touch, I think, with the tradition, with the world that they'd come from in a way that people aren't so much in touch with that now.
I mean, I think of that sort of colonial era Australiana, Banjo Patterson, the man from Snowy River, that you might not know the history of the era, but you'll know the sentiments, the struggles, Waltzing Matilda too.
Absolutely.
I mean, songs are basically poetry, just sung rather than spoken. So they really do evoke a bygone era, the sentiments of the time. There's a fabulous story that Churchill used to play Waltzing Matilda for Menzies, and Menzies said, he wrote, "It is one of my lasting memories that after dinner at Chequers, we would come out into the hall for coffee. In deference to the Australian visitor, the spokesman for a country whose soldiers at that time were chasing the Italians out of Cyrenaica, Churchill would say, 'Mary, put on Waltzing Matilda.' And to the music of that genuinely Australian song, he would waltz gravely around the hall, a boy's grin on his face and the light of a rich human understanding in his eyes."
That says something beautiful about Churchill as much as it says something beautiful about Menzies.
Yes.
That era of Australian poetry that we think of at the turn of the last century is really part of a broader era of things that were occurring in the arts, whether it was the Heidelberg School, Australian Impressionist paintings, Australian poets, the role of the Bulletin magazine that was asserting a different sort of Australian identity based not on us being, as it were, a New Britannia in another world, but being a country that had its own landscape, a country that had its own traditions, a country that was very agricultural based. And although we were already, by the turn of the century, one of the most urbanised nations on earth, there was a strength and a reflection from those bush legends that was coming through as the sort of radical nationalist view of Australia at the time through poets like Banjo Patterson and Henry Lawson and so on. It's also true that there are still poems being written today and still poets today. Even in magazines like Quadrant Poets are published. There are poets that win literary awards. I think about Sarah Holland Batt, whose great book, The Jaguar, is the prize I'm giving Year 12 students this year. The poem's about the passing of her father who had dementia. So I still think poetry is important, and it has an ability, because of its brevity, because of the cleverness of word choice, because of the timbre, because of the evocative nature of it, to be more memorable in a sense to people than reading ordinary prose.
I think there's also something there, you talk about the emergence of Australia and this sense of a new identity and how poetry helps with that. Menzies clearly admires Henry Kendall, and it's quite clear that he admires Henry Kendall as a sort of Australian Wordsworth. Mm. And he's written in the book, we have some of his prose about literature. And he talks, it's very clear how much he admires Wordsworth, and he has this deep romantic sort of attachment to the landscape. And what I think is really interesting is that you can see he likes about Henry Kendall that Kendall is finding this sort of experience in the Australian landscape, and it's drawing on a British tradition. There's a tradition of poetry that allows them to access the Australian landscape. And I find it's something that really impresses me about the collection, also about his writing, the prose where he writes about the landscape that we've included in the book. And you get the sense this is a man who really felt a deep attachment to the Australian landscape. You wouldn't expect that of him, and it comes through that it really mattered to him. And he appreciates that Henry Kendall is able to articulate what he also feels, and that they're using, that they can admire what Wordsworth does. And this is a continuation of a tradition. And I think this is central to understanding Menzies because he values the tradition. This is a long tradition and it can be developed and extended in Australia, and he admires that. And he tries, I think the difference between him and Kendall, in the book you've got his poem To a Mountain, which I think is inspired by Henry Kendall's poem, A Dedication to a Mountain, and he talks about that. And I'm not saying that the Menzies poem is as good as the Kendall poem, but I think he admires what Kendall has done and he wants to try and do that as a young student. And it's impressive that he's trying. And it goes to this idea that he thinks this tradition that they've received from England, a way of using language to give expression to experience, is relevant to trying to capture what's special about the Australian experience.
I shared the same view as you, Damien. I was surprised because we always think of Menzies, unfairly so, as an Anglophile, and he loved Britain and its institutions and so on. And you're right, he did see us as an extension of the intellectual traditions from the old world, as it were. But you do get so clearly in the book his love of Australia and particularly the Australian landscape and what an effect that had on him. And when he's writing in some of those reflections, the other thing that's interesting is his great desire to see Australian poetry treasured and become a very important part of what Australian culture, which is, as you put it, a continuation of the British culture, is all really about.
Yeah, I mean, I'd have two reactions to both your comments there. One, I think this book and his handling of the Australian landscape gives you an insight into the boy from Japarat, from the countryside. He's not the double-breasted suit-wearing metropolitan or urbane statesman that he appears in photographs or in the footage you see of him. He actually starts off life in a pretty difficult Wimmera Mallee landscape of Western Victoria, but with that kind of tragic beauty that you see in the Grampians. And he's explaining that through his poetry, which is beautiful. The other thing, and you picked up on that, Julian, is the idea that Australian literature will one day, he hopes, be the match of the British literary tradition. He is a proud Australian. He's a patriot. But he realises Australia is still on a sort of journey of development. And that's something I think as people living in 2025, it's hard to grapple with that idea that Australia was a developing country, basically. Through its colonial era, it was developing institutions, developing infrastructure, developing human capital. We had to set up universities, let alone schools. And so our literary tradition just didn't exist. It had to form and develop. The academics, the literary experts, the professors, they were imported from Britain. They weren't of our own initially. But we, through generations and through development of education and our university system, our talent, were able to meet Britain where it was. But it was something he was proud of and he wanted to be part of that development.
You got the sense that Menzies was both an Australian nationalist and an empire loyalist. And that's where he was correctly in his time. And, there's nothing wrong, I think, with acknowledging that our traditions do come from Britain and that there is a beauty in the British tradition that is to be admired. And that was the foundation for what's become the Australian tradition.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think the other thing that I'd like to pick up on, Julian, your mention of as a prize in your electorate, you give the poetry book the Jaguar.
The Jaguar, yes.
And it strikes me that, that's lovely, but that's a bit unusual. And I wonder if there is a decline in the way we educate our children, our younger generation, when it comes to literature and appreciation of words, of the power of words, especially now in an era of AI where AI, large language models are going to do it for us.
Well, I hope not. I
hope not.
I hope that you will still find creatives that will arise and produce original thought. And, that's certainly something that I've been saying in the context of discussions that we're having about whether there should be a sort of data mining exemption for big tech companies. But yes, I suspect it is unusual to give a book of poems as a prize. The school I went to at the end of the year, the headmaster gave us all a book of 2 poems, which had been the tradition at the school since the 1940s. This is the first year I've given a book of poetry as a prize. I tend to get a book from the National Library, but I was so struck by this set of poems from Sarah Holland Batt about the experience of losing her father, and some of them are just so clever. All of them are extremely clever, but there are some that really got me. There's a poem. She finds him dead in the corridor at the hospital, and she then tells a story about how he used to love to watch these videos of Pavarotti singing Nessun Dorma. And in the middle of the poem, you've got the Pavarotti performance, you've got the discussion of Turandot, and then at the end you get reminded that this is actually about her father who has died. And some of the imagery about his head craning like a sunflower towards the light of the image, to me it was so evocative. And the poem spoke to me and I wanted to share them. And I think, that's what you should do with art. If it speaks to you, you should tell other people about it and you should share it with them.
Yeah, well, absolutely. Well, they're very lucky your young constituents.
I hope they enjoy the book.
I hope so too.
Maybe I should give them fancies I dare not speak.
I actually was thinking that, that can be next year's prizes.
Indeed.
Damien, you suggested that poetry allowed Menzies to express emotions he wouldn't have been able to express in public. I mean, yes, I think that's true, but what about today? Modern day politicians, we've got a modern day politician here with us, so I'm not asking him, I'm asking you. Do you think there is space for them to express emotions in public through, we're not seeing political poets so much these days.
No, we're not. We probably don't see so many poetic outbursts. But of course, this is a feature of the fact, I think, that politicians are expected to express their emotion all the time. We expect to hear how you feel about everything. And if you don't show us how you feel, that's a problem. And he's in a very different world where there's an expectation that leaders will be restrained and dignified and not articulate themselves. And in some ways, it's probably good that this is a feature. Prince Harry liked to talk about the fact that, the stiff upper lip isn't the good thing that it used to be in British society. And that this is a change, I think, in leadership, that it's not seen to be the case. But as a result, there's an expectation that politicians are constantly explaining how they feel in sound bites, and they're not thought through in the way that poetry is. And of course, this is a feature of a different world, in a world where people are much more circumspect about what they say publicly. That's going to lend itself much more to something like poetry than a world where people are expected every day to articulate how they feel. Every time there's a national disaster, you're expected to have a response to that. And if we don't sense that that's your genuine personal response, this is sort of a problem. And
need to be authentic.
Yes. Yeah. And what it means to be authentic is not going to mean composing a poem. They're under too much pressure. So I think it's not surprising that we don't see the sort of reflectiveness that maybe you saw in Menzies.
It's interesting looking at political figures from bygone eras. Paddy Glynn, he was a Shakespearean scholar. Samuel Griffith published his own translation of Dante's Divine Comedy, which is, that's
amazing.
That's pretty amazing. Chifley and Menzies both were very appreciative of literature and poetry, and despite being political opposites, they exchanged a lot of friendly communication around that. So,
and Alfred Deakin, of course, wrote under a nom de plume as the correspondent to one of the London newspapers during most of his political career.
Yeah.
That may be the only way that a politician would write poetry today is under a nom de plume, I suspect.
But, we see in bygone eras these very literate politicians who, Churchill and Menzies. Even Boris Johnson, he would use a lot of literary references that sort of underpinned their ability to communicate powerfully, I think. Menzies was a master of the art of politics, but his art of communication was unsurpassed. People, his enemies or his fans alike, would rave about his town hall speeches because he was so engaging. And you look at speeches that Winston Churchill gives, and I had the great pleasure the other day of visiting Andrew Roberts' house, the great British historian, and he has a speech of Churchill's, and it's actually laid out the way he was going to deliver it, because delivery
so important,
and the poetry of it was really, really important.
Absolutely. And I think, in it's actually important that we have politicians who have a literary background and who are well read, because one of the things you find in politics is that you're suddenly having to draw on a lifetime of whatever education you've had in a range of different experiences when you're trying to make a speech, whether that's even an occasion locally. You're often asked to speak at Anzac Days and so on to tell a story about Australia and its military tradition. But in the House regularly, you're asked to speak on bills on such a wide variety of topics. And if you haven't brought with you a decent education and you haven't brought with you a wide reading, you have less to draw on. I think it's just harder.
But if I could say about that, I think there's another side to it, which is it only really works when your audience has the same education. Like if you make some allusion to Shakespeare and your audience understands that, they're like, oh, it resonates. If they don't, then it's like you just seem arrogant
Falls
or something.
a bit flat.
It doesn't work. So, and now this is the same with the Bible. There was a time when you could make a reference to the Bible in passing and everyone would know what that meant. And I wrote a short book about Dame Leonie Kramer. She talks about when she was teaching, and that's a long time ago because she's been dead for some decade now, and she hadn't been teaching a long time before that, but she said there was something that came up. I think they were talking about Milton, and there was a reference to the flood, and she said to them, do you know what the flood is? And they didn't know about Noah's Ark and the flood. And now Milton, he's assuming that his audience just know that and it's obvious. And once you've got a world in which there's no shared language, part of the importance of this is a shared language. So if everyone studies Shakespeare at school, we've got some sort of common tradition that we can call on. But if it's only something that, I have as a sort of personal hobby, that's not quite the same. And, part of, I think, for these people that you referred to is that I think they were gifted and impressive people, but they were also immersed in a tradition that they took it, that everyone around them had some vague understanding of, even if they didn't have the ability to quote from Shakespeare, that people would pick up what it was.
You're more likely to get a popular culture reference today in a political speech because that's the culture of the day. And this goes back to the point that you made, Georgina, that, Menzies was at university here at the University of Melbourne before even radio had been invented. And so what was the popular culture of the day? It was books and poetry. And it was the Bible and it was Shakespeare and it was part of our shared inheritance. And people read that more widely because there weren't the diversions that we have today. They were the diversions of their time.
Yeah. And the music was opera. And now we think of opera as, very elite and highbrow. But actually, Dame Nellie Melba was the Taylor Swift of her generation.
Yeah.
I mean, it's amazing to think that. So this collection here, it's been laid out in chronological order. So it starts off with the Jeps versus Bows football match in the late 19th century through to the student days, early politics, and then later politics. And as you go through, you see Menzies becoming more lighthearted. He's very earnest as a child, as a student. And then as a politician, perhaps because of the stresses and strains of the job, he just writes a lot of doggerel, basically. Julian, as someone who's been involved in politics for a very long time, since he was 16, but of course now in Australia's Parliament as the federal member for Berowra, who is the politician who has an unseen, wittier side, maybe a poetic side, the ability to produce such doggerel?
I don't know that I've seen any politician produce doggerel that I can think of in my time in the Parliament, but sometimes it's the politicians that have the most serious jobs that are the ones that have the best wit. But the public never gets to see the wit because the public just sees the serious job. So Peter Dutton, who was until recently the leader of the Liberal Party, was actually great fun company, wonderful sense of humour, very witty, loved to tease colleagues and so on. But because so much of his job was always dealing with national security type issues, I think the public never got to see that. But maybe there should be some sort of competition for the Parliament's best poem or something like that.
I think so. I mean, you obviously have the Parliament parliamentary sort of sporting clubs, and that's great for the
Parliamentary Poets Society.
The Dev Poets Society of
as
Parliament.
someone who's a little bit, of a sport dud,
Yeah.
I've always enjoyed other outlets like debating where I, might excel. Poetry, I haven't actually had a crack at that, but bring it on, Julian. I think in your new role as Shadow Minister for Education and obviously Shadow Minister for the Arts, I think it's incumbent on you to start a movement for a parliamentary poetry club.
I think there's also something, though, you say we don't see the wit, but part of it isn't just that you see your colleagues' wit, it's that you can see the opponent's wit. And that there are some poems in here where he's writing about Labor figures. And we see the reason we talk about the opposition, not the enemy, in the sense that it is His Majesty's loyal opposition and they're loyal to the King, but even then they're opponents and not their enemies. And, of course, that can't come out publicly. Publicly, they have to be clear about what they disagree about. This sort of poetry shows that through wit, through mirth, through light-hearted banter, there is the ability to find a rapport. And it struck me only as I was coming here today, I wrote a book not about parliamentarians but about the judges, my book about Roddy Mark QC. And a feature of that book is it had the cartoons that Michael Kirby used to sketch for them when they were sitting together in the Court of Appeal. So they were two of the three judges. And Kirby would sit there drawing these sketches, some of which would be quite, I think people would find quite shocking that Michael Kirby had drawn things like this. And he passed them to Roddy Marr when they were sitting there. And this was a sort of, two people who you'd think were very different and didn't have a great deal in common. And yet through this, in that case, it wasn't poetry, it was cartooning. But you saw the way humour, artistic expression of humour allowed for something unusual to happen between colleagues who otherwise were quite different.
And very serious by outward appearance.
Dealing
too.
in a very serious situation, Georgina, I want to ask you a question because what's beautiful about the book, you've got this terrific introduction by Damien that puts the book and Menzies' poetry and the parliamentary milieu into which he found himself in context. But you, along with William Cook and Victoria Ronas, have put together this collection. Tell us something about how you chose the poems and how you put them together.
Well, we were very lucky because Troy Bramston, the journalist and author, and he is not just an author, he's written a biography of Robert Menzies, The Art of Politics, had actually discovered a real treasure trove of Robert Menzies' poems in his papers in the National Library of Australia. So that really started the interest in it. And then we're based here at the University of Melbourne. There's a Menzies collection, and part of that collection are Melbourne University magazines. And these were the magazines produced by students in the late 19th century, early 20th century, and Menzies was one of the editors. And in these magazines were his poems. And so we were able to piece together poetry we found from Troy, poetry we found in the Melbourne University magazines. And then it just developed from there. Heather Henderson, Robert Menzies' daughter, had some poetry that she had received and collected. There's a lovely publication, The Wit of Robert Menzies, so that's where you get a lot of the doggerel that was published in the 1960s. And it was actually ended up being, it's a bit of detective work, but it ended up being quite easy because it was something he was very prolific at in a way. I just wonder how many we've missed because, we'd like to think it's extensive, but I think there'll be ones that are hidden away somewhere. There's on page 38, and obviously for those listening to the podcast, we encourage you to buy this book. It's on our website in our bookstore. There's an image from the Sydney-based journal The Nation, and it has a front page story, R.G. Menzies, the young poet. And this was in 1959. He wasn't so young then, but still it's a nice young photo of him. So he was known as a poet, although that legacy didn't stick, did it?
But I think we had to say about the detective work because we were, and you mentioned what might have been left out, and we were talking before we started here and it was observed, there's poems about sport, about death, about the landscape, no love poetry.
No.
And I think part of the thing of this trying to find things is, for all we know, he did write love poetry and it was given to Dame Patty, and she decided this wasn't something that that should be shared beyond the two of them. We just don't know. And so there's a sense in which we're sort of, now I think our curiosity is pricked to think, yes, what would it have been like for Menzies to write love poetry to Dame Patty, and to think that actually he was capable of doing that. And it's a reminder that there's sides to him that we wouldn't otherwise see him, and may still not. It may get discovered in a box somewhere.
Yeah.
It may be that she burnt it. We don't. Maybe it was never written, but we don't know.
We don't have a love poem, but as close as we can get to is this poem from Heather's autograph book. I love this, and I'm going to read it. Actually, I should get Julian to read it because you've got a better speaking voice.
It's probably a bit closer to Menzies' voice, a bit deeper.
Yes, this one here.
Heather's autograph book. To sign your name in a little girl's book is a pleasure the fairies send. For you turn the page, and wherever you look, you'll see the name of a friend. But mine is the name of a friend as well, for Heather's a friend to me. Though I'm grown and grey, you can never tell how young I can manage to be. It may seem funny, but still it's true. We're as friendly as bricks and mortar. For I'm her father. How'd you do? And she's my blue-eyed daughter.
It's gorgeous,
Isn't that beautiful?
It? Beautiful. So I do have a question here. What's your favourite poem in the collection? And that's one of my two favourites. But Julian, did you have one that you...
My favourite is The Soul of Hope, a reform song, because you get a sense of Menzies' liberalism in that poem, which I think is really beautiful. And you know, he's a politician who writes poetry. He's not writing political poems as such, but this was the closest in the collection, I thought, to that.
Yeah, and so that's written in 1914. It's published in the Melbourne University magazine. The editor made a good decision to publish it, being one and the same person, I suspect. Yes. What about you, Damien?
Well, I was mentioning before that poem To a Mountain, where you see this engagement with the sublime and the way he's trying to capture something that he admires clearly, that Kendall can capture, that can deploy a tradition that we find in Wordsworth. And you can see he admires that, and it's something to remember. If we think about painting, and you think about Arthur Boyd's paintings, and one of his great achievements was the way he took sort of traditional biblical scenes or scenes from Greek and Roman mythology, and he would place them in the Australian landscape. And the significance of that, to say the Australian landscape was a legitimate way of dealing with these subject matters. And you can see, I think part of what he admires in Kendall is something similar, that he can evoke the sublime in the Australian landscape, and that the Australian landscape's worthy of that. And I like the fact, I'm not saying it's a great poem, but you can see the student desperately trying to do that, and you admire that he's trying to imitate the master. And I think, it's a reminder of the way the sublime arouses so much in him in the Australian landscape, that he wants to try to put down in words something of how it makes him feel.
I said Menzies wasn't known as a poet or for poetry, but of course one of the most enduring things people do remember him for is a bit of poetry, isn't it? It's the Thomas Ford, the 17th century British poet, who wrote, "I did but see her passing by, and yet I'll love her till I die." And Menzies quotes this for the Queen's visit in 1963. And it's used as an example by his critics of his Anglophilia. He's sort of, British to his boot heels, and an out-of-date empire man, and sort of Edwardian, antediluvian. But actually a different reading of it is that, he admired the Queen, yes, and he was a monarchist, yes, and good company of two good monarchists here. But he was someone who really valued the power of poetry to express a sentiment.
I suspect that line came to him off the cuff there and then. And there's a history of this with Menzies, because he had such a well-furnished mind, because he'd read so much poetry, because he could just draw on this for occasion. One of the stories that's told about him in the Alan Martin biography, I think it's one of the first stories about him as a young lawyer, is that he turned up at a dinner. He'd just gone to the bar, and the High Court had visited from Sydney, and this rather stuffy senior barrister was asked to make a speech about Sir Adrian Knox, the new Chief Justice, and the room had fallen to sleep. And Sir Hayden Stark, later to serve on the High Court, who'd organised the event, who didn't much like Menzies, said to him, Menzies, you make a toast to Sir Edmund Barton. And so Menzies got up and he recited some lines of poetry. And that was the toast. And he won acclaim for this. So I think he was the sort of person who had these, in the same way that Ronald Reagan had scraps of dialogue from movies running around in his mind, Robert Menzies had poetic lines from a lifetime of reading and engagement that he could draw on at the drop of a hat.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a wonderful anecdote, but I guess feeds into the 1963 Royal Tour. That was the
him.
way he spoke.
It was him. But the other thing about that, I think, is it was evoking a shared feeling. He was capturing how the country felt. Okay, and it is in the first person singular, I, but he was really articulating it was a public speech. I don't think he was just talking about how he felt. And actually, if you read, because this is part of it, is only that couplet is remembered. If you read the speech, he's talking about what the visit means to the people of Australia. And that is evoking how everyone felt. And a lot of people today seem to find it hard to understand that, but it was a shared feeling, and it was a sense of everyone, by and large, felt this, and he was articulating through poetry something we all felt in that moment.
The monarchy was hugely popular in the 1950s and 60s. In the 1954 visit of the Queen, the first visit of a monarch to Australia, 75% of the population physically saw her. I mean,
it's extraordinary.
Because there wasn't TV until 56. So if you wanted to see the Queen, you had to turn out. And she did visit 55 cities. So it was, there were opportunities.
If I can say, seeing as we're amongst monarchists, so part of what's so special about that is the Queen is the physical embodiment of this ancient tradition that he valued, and that at the time it was still the case that most people valued, and they understood the importance of this. And this goes to what we were talking about with him appreciating poetry as a tradition and hoping to see the day that the tradition will be developed further in Australia, and this sense that, so much importance that he attaches to tradition, and that the things that he values are the manifestation of a tradition. And in a book that we published earlier this year, Finding Menzies, there's a chapter talking about the first visit he made to England, and he's talking at Chatham House, and he's trying to explain to these English people what it means to be Australian, in the sense in which Australians think of themselves as being British. And he says it comes down to the fact that they believe in freedom, but they believe in freedom in the British tradition of freedom. And this is the sense in which he thinks they're British. The things that matter to him most, freedom, for instance, are things that are articulated through a tradition. It's through the particular history of freedom that he thinks is what's distinctive about us as Australians. We value this tradition. The monarchy is the ultimate embodiment of tradition. And this appeal of poetry, it's clear that he wants to understand the tradition. He wants to understand the way the tradition is developing in Australia, and the way that great poets, and this is the point about artistic genius, is that they're able to use the tradition, and that in doing so they can extend the tradition in new ways in order to express themselves in an original way. And that's what he admires, I think, about Australian poetry, when it gets to the point that this tradition can be extended in a way that allows for the expression of what's distinctive about the Australian experience. And these things all fit together, this commitment to tradition and the monarchy and poetry and the common law. These things all are continuous for him.
And what I wanted to move slightly away from poetry, but staying with the arts and education. Menzies is called the father of the Australian university, and rightly so. During the second Menzies government, the number of universities in Australia doubled. The number of students who are able to attend universities in Australia tripled. So, huge, huge changes. And we live with that legacy today. And this is a contemporary question for you, Julian. The Liberal Party these days is really not seen as the party of education. I mean, Menzies is seen as a bit of a total outlier, actually, of prime ministers, because he invested huge financial capital, government money, federal government money, but also political capital in universities. He knew that an educated nation was a successful nation. His Commonwealth scholarships weren't tied to whether you were going to be job ready or not. They were, there for bright students who didn't have the means to attend a university by virtue of their parents paying fees, but they had the mental capacity. It enabled them to go to university and study literature or philosophy or history or poetry, whatever. So, the Liberal Party's reputation and policy direction on education, on higher education and the arts seems very distant from the Menzies tradition and history.
Well, I hope that we're able to go through a period of restoration. Glyn Davis, who was Vice-Chancellor here at Melbourne University for many years, was fond of saying that all education policy is biography. And in many respects, Menzies' education policy and his expansion of the university sector was his own biography. He was a person whose life had been transformed. A country kid, meagre circumstances, worked hard and rose to lead his profession, his party, his nation. And he wanted to give other people that opportunity. That's fundamentally what it was about. But I don't think that the educational opportunities that Menzies put forward died with Menzies. In fact, I think during the Howard years, particularly when you look at the expansion of non-government schools, particularly low-fee, largely faith-based schools, that was a great achievement of John Howard, building on the Menzies policy of state aid to non-government schools, which provided parents with more choice. And at a time when Australia is a more diverse country than we've been in terms of people coming from different backgrounds and different religious traditions, actually we need to ensure that we've got the choices that are available so that parents can educate their children either in a terrific government school like the one that Menzies attended as a primary school student, terrific Catholic school, or a terrific independent school, in some places in accordance with their faith, but in some cases in accordance with a secular tradition. And I think that that's really important. And in terms of the arts, I think it's one of Labor's great myths that they like to think that all arts policy began in 1972 with the election of that great Medici, Gough Whitlam. But the truth is that it was the McMahon government that set up much of the arts infrastructure that we now regard as part of the landscape. It was McMahon who set up the Australia Council. It was Menzies, it was Deakin who set up pensions, I think, for writers, Menzies and the Commonwealth Literary Council, Menzies and the National Library of Australia. There is a long tradition there, and that's also, again, been burnished on our side. I mean, you think about some of the great institutions in Canberra, like the National Portrait Gallery, which came to life during recent years, the transformation of Old Parliament House from what was simply the first place that the Parliament met in Canberra to now the Museum of Australian Democracy, the National Museum of Australia. These were places that were achievements of Liberal governments, both the Howard government and then the Abbott Turnbull Morrison government. And I think we should be proud of that tradition. I want to see an Australia where young people see that the arts are part of their birthright as Australian citizens, and that we have more young people getting the opportunity to engage with the literary tradition of the country and the musical tradition and the visual arts and the performing arts. And I think what we need to do, because that's part of our inheritance as Australians, and therefore that's something that I believe all Australians should have, and I want to explore how we can make those opportunities more available to more Australians.
Yeah, well said, Julian. And thank you so much for joining me on Afternoon Light, launching Fancies I Dare Not Speak. And thank you to you, Damien, for the fabulous introduction you wrote and your work in bringing this book to light. I hope that for those who do buy it, they will note that it is very similar in publication to the Forgotten People broadcast book that you can buy of the 37 Forgotten People broadcasts that were published all the way back in 1943. So there's a lovely, I think, set you can purchase together of the poetry and the political philosophy. And who knows, we may add to the collection in years to come. So thank you both.
And Georgina, with fewer than 100 days to Christmas, nothing says Merry Christmas like Fancies I Dare Not Speak.
That's right.
Thank you to you for extending and burnishing the legacy of Robert Menzies and making sure that Australians have a full sense of this remarkable Australian.
That's it for this week's episode of Afternoon Light, the podcast of the Robert Menzies Institute. Please make sure to subscribe and catch up on our latest online content on our website or on Twitter, LinkedIn or Facebook.